the sky, was wrong. A suffocating, unearthly darkness had fallen over Golgotha, the place of the skull. It was the 6th hour, and yet the sun had vanished from the heavens. An ominous twilight spread across the land, swallowing the voices of the jeering crowd in a cloak of dread. Dust swirled in the air. Somewhere in the distance, dogs had stopped barking. Even the wind held its breath. And at the center of it all, 3 crosses stood like grim monuments. He stood there, rigid, silent, battle-hardened, wearing the red cloak of command and the armor of Rome's unyielding will. His name would not be remembered by the empire, but the world would remember his gaze fixed upon the man nailed to the center cross. He was a centurion, commander of 100. This was not his first execution. Blood, death, despair, they were tools of the trade. He was a sword in the hand of Caesar, sharpened by years of violence and duty. And yet, something was different. This prisoner, this Jesus of Nazareth, had not cried out in rage. He had not begged. He had not cursed the men who stripped him, whipped him, nailed him to wood and raised him high before the mocking crowd. He had only looked at them with sorrow, not defiance, not fear. The centurion's jaw tightened. He had overseen many deaths, but never one like this. A flash of memory struck. This man's eyes, bloodied but still full of peace, meeting his as the cross was hoisted. Not a word had been spoken between them, but it was as if the prisoner had seen into him, into the soldier buried under layers of steel and years of hardened flesh. The centurion's fingers gripped his spear. And then, at once, it happened. The ground lurched. The earth groaned like something ancient and wounded. From the direction of the temple in the city, a cry pierced the air, not of a man, but of stone, splitting. The veil, they would later say, had torn from top to bottom. He turned back to the cross. The man was dead, head bowed, arms limp. But the air, it pulsed. The soldier staggered back. For the first time in years, his legs betrayed him. And then, the words tumbled from his mouth, unbidden, burning, undeniable. Truly, this man was the Son of God. The words still rang in his ears like a bell struck deep in the soul. He hadn't meant to speak them aloud, but they had risen within him with a force he could not contain, like fire erupting through cracks in stone. The other soldiers stared. Some laughed nervously. Others looked away, unsettled. But the centurion, he couldn't look away. The darkness still lingered. The air carried the scent of iron and sweat. Blood stained the earth beneath the cross. But something else hung there now, something the empire could not explain. A silence that accused. A silence that revealed. This wasn't just the death of a man. This was the unraveling of everything he thought he understood. He had killed without guilt. He had served without question. Rome had taught him to obey, to conquer, to extinguish weakness with ruthlessness. And yet here, on this hill of execution, he had witnessed a strength unlike any he had ever known. Not the strength of iron, not the strength of empire. A different strength, one that forgave even while nails pierced hands. One that comforted a dying thief, one that looked upon torment and spoke of paradise. And it broke something in him. The world shifted. The line between power and truth, between duty and righteousness, it blurred before his eyes. And it all began with a death. But to understand the weight of that moment, to grasp how it shattered the soul of a soldier, we must understand who he had been. The Roman centurion, an elite among warriors. Born and bred for war, he had risen through blood. Discipline and violence were his tools. He commanded with authority drawn not from birthright, but from tested brutality. Men followed him not because they loved him, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. His life was ordered, forged by legionary doctrine. From sunrise drills to midnight marches, from the siege of rebellious cities to the crucifixions outside Jerusalem's gates, his life was violence in service of law. He was not a philosopher. He was not a priest. He was not a seeker of truth. He was an implement. A centurion was expected to be the very spine of Rome's military engine. Not the highest in rank, but perhaps the most vital. He ate with his men but stood above them in judgment. He slept little, punished swiftly, and obeyed orders without delay or doubt. He had overseen executions before. He had seen men beg for mercy, curse their gods, spit at their accusers, scream until the weight of their lungs collapsed into silence. Crucifixion was not a clean death. It was a theater of humiliation, a weapon of terror, a slow unraveling of the human body under the open sky. And the Centurion, he had been its conductor. He believed in Rome, in its gods, in its destiny, in the Pax Romana, even if it was enforced by blood. He did not question orders. He did not waste thought on the condemned. Until now. Until this one. Jesus. The name had been whispered through the barracks long before this day. Some called him a rabbi, others a heretic. Some said he performed wonders, that he healed the blind, raised the dead. But none of that mattered to a centurion. What mattered was this: Rome had found him guilty. The sentence was death, and the centurion, he was the blade that carried it out. He had approached the task as he always had, with professional detachment. And yet, something had shifted. Not in the crowd, not in the order. In him. He didn't know it yet, but the fire had already been lit. Each moment that passed, each glance, each word, each breath drawn by the man on the cross would deepen the crack that had formed in the stone of his soul. Soon it would shatter. It began before the nails, before the thorns, before the cross rose like a curse above the earth. The centurion had been summoned early that morning. Jerusalem was tense. Passover always was. Crowds gathered. Rumors spread like wildfire. The prefect, Pontius Pilate, had been warned. Another Galilean rabble-rouser was stirring the people. The orders were clear: keep the peace, and if peace demanded blood, then so be it. At the fortress of Antonia, the centurion watched the prisoner brought forward, shackled, bruised, but upright. There was something strange in the air, an unease that had nothing to do with the weather. Pilate, usually cold and indifferent, seemed restless. This man, Jesus, was unlike the zealots, the brigands, the blasphemers they often dragged through these halls. He was calm. The crowd outside raged. They demanded death. "Crucify him!" they screamed. Pilate's voice trembled with something the centurion had never heard before: doubt. He offered the crowd Barabbas, a known criminal, as a substitute. But they chose Jesus. The centurion noticed the flicker in Pilate's eyes. Was it fear? Regret? Then came the scourging. The centurion gave the order. It was routine. His men knew what to do. Leather lashes studded with bone and metal. Skin tore. Blood sprayed. Jesus collapsed more than once. But he didn't scream. Not once. He gritted his teeth. He winced. But no plea came. No curses. Only breath. Steady, ragged, but steady. And the centurion. He watched, detached at first, until his gaze locked with the prisoners. Not a glance of hatred, not of defiance, but something else. Pity. For him. The soldier looked away, shaken. The mocking followed. A robe, a crown of thorns, a reed in his hand. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they jeered. But the centurion did not join. For the first time in his career, the act of humiliation felt wrong. They pressed the crossbeam upon the prisoner's torn back, and then began the procession to Golgotha. The centurion led the way, shouting commands, clearing the path through throngs of people who hurled insults and stones. But even amid the chaos, he noticed the way the condemned man moved. Not like a criminal, but like one carrying something more than wood. He fell. Once, twice, a third time. Each time the centurion's instincts screamed to pull him up, to hurry it along. But he found himself hesitating. Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry the beam for the final stretch. The centurion gave the order, but something inside him twisted. Not anger, not impatience, a quiet ache. At the roadside, a group of women wept, mourning as if this was no ordinary execution. Jesus turned to them, and though his body trembled from blood loss, his voice was clear. "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. The centurion heard the words. He didn't understand them, not fully, but they chilled him. This was no rebellion. This was prophecy. Then they reached the hill. Golgotha. The soldiers went about their work with mechanical precision, stripping, nailing, raising the crosses. The centurion watched, too closely. Every movement, every cry from the crowd, every silent word from the man in the middle. And then, as the cross rose and the crowd roared, the prisoner spoke again. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The centurion's hand clenched around his spear. Forgive? It wasn't the word he expected. He had heard curses, desperate pleas, madness, but not forgiveness, and not spoken to heaven. He turned to his men. Some sneered. Others seemed unsure. Above the man's head, a crude inscription read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." The centurion stared at it, and the fire grew. It would be hours yet before the end, before the quake, before the veil. But already, something inside him was dying. The part that believed Rome's power was absolute, the part that trusted only in law and discipline and iron. That part was breaking, and something else, something terrifying and beautiful, was being born. The sun climbed higher, but the light did not. A strange gloom settled over Golgotha, Sarsa, thick and pressing, as if the heavens themselves recoiled at what was unfolding. The centurion stood, silent, the dust swirling at his feet. 3 men hung between earth and sky, 2 criminals and 1 enigma. The crucified thief on the left spat curses, mocking Jesus with his dying breath. "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other thief, gasping, rebuked him. "Do you not fear God? We are receiving the due reward for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned to Jesus. The centurion leaned forward to catch the words. "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." The centurion's brow furrowed. A kingdom? From a cross? He waited for mockery, for silence. But instead, the prisoner turned to the dying thief and spoke, gentle and unwavering. "Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." The centurion exhaled. What kind of man says this with his life draining into the dust? No hate, no desperation, only promise, only hope. The crowd began to thin. The religious leaders moved away, satisfied with their cruelty. The sky grew darker and the wind colder. Time passed slowly, and then it came, the cry, the moment that would split history. The centurion saw it, heard it, felt it. Jesus lifted his face to the sky, blood and sweat pouring down his brow, and called out, not in rage but in agony of the soul, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It wasn't a cry of defeat. It wasn't a question without faith. It was lament, deep, ancient, human. The centurion felt a pang in his chest, unfamiliar and sharp. Was this divine abandonment, or was it divine empathy? Moments later, Jesus summoned what strength he had left. He drew a final breath, and with it came the words, "It is finished." His head fell forward, his body sagged, and the world convulsed. The ground groaned with a deep, primal roar. Stones cracked. The earth heaved beneath the centurion's feet. People screamed. Even the birds fell silent. And somewhere, the curtain of the great temple, thick, massive, woven to separate the Holy of Holies, was torn in two, not by hands, from top to bottom. The centurion fell to his knees. The words escaped him again, now not in confusion, but in certainty, in reverent horror. Truly, this man was the Son of God. The other soldiers backed away, muttering. Some stared at the sky, terrified. Others fled toward the city. But he remained, kneeling, face to the dust that drank the blood of the innocent. The cross loomed above him, not just a tool of execution, but now a throne. His eyes stung, not from dust, from something deeper, something unshielded. Everything he had built within himself, stone upon stone of Roman pride, soldiers' training, imperial allegiance, was crumbling. In that moment, he no longer stood as Rome's servant. He knelt as a witness, a witness to death that gave life, a witness to power redefined not by conquest but by surrender. And yet, his duty was not yet done. There remained one final act. He rose, trembling, stepping forward under the darkened sky. A few of the priests had returned. They demanded the death be confirmed before the Sabbath. The crucified men were to be removed. The centurion nodded. His job was not finished. He approached the cross. Jesus' body was still, silent. But to ensure death, it must be proven. Custom called for the breaking of legs, but he had seen enough to know. This man was gone. Still, Rome required certainty. He raised his spear and drove it into the man's side. Blood and water flowed, clear, unmistakable, and in that moment, the centurion froze. His breath caught. The flow touched his hand, and something stirred within him. Some say he had been afflicted with failing eyes, a hidden ailment that plagued him in silence. Others say his vision of the world, of truth, had always been clouded by the empire. But the moment the fluid touched him, his eyes cleared. He saw, not just with the eyes of a soldier, with the eyes of a man reborn. He turned from the cross, the blood of the crucified still warm upon his hand. The crowd had all but vanished now. Some fled in terror, others slinked away in silence. But the centurion remained, alone in the gathering dusk. His spear was still slick. His heart was not. For the first time in his life he felt the weight of his own soul. He gave the order to lower the body. Carefully, more carefully than ever before, he oversaw the removal. The man was dead, yes, but not defeated. There was no triumph in this death, no boastful cheers or toasts to Caesar. Only awe, only silence. He stood back as a wealthy man named Joseph came forward to claim the body. With trembling hands, the centurion approved the release. There was no reason to deny him now. No law, no emperor, no order could restrain the majesty of what had just transpired. He watched as the body was wrapped, shrouded in linen. He watched as the tomb closed. And then he walked. Not back to the garrison. Not to report to Pilate. Not to his quarters. He walked into the dark. Something inside him refused to return to the world as it was. For days he wandered, through the valleys, along the dusty roads outside the city. He didn't speak. He remembered. Every word, every cry, every glance. He sought out the followers, the ones who had disappeared into the shadows after the arrest. Most were in hiding, afraid, confused. But some spoke to him. They didn't trust him at first. Why would they? He was a killer, a Roman, the one who had stood at the foot of the cross. But when he spoke of what he saw, when he repeated those words, truly this man was the Son of God, they listened. And when he told them of the water and blood, of the healing that followed, of the piercing that revealed the truth, they wept. He stayed. He learned. He asked questions, not about politics, but about prophecy, not about conquest, but about grace. He sat among fishermen and tax collectors, women once cast aside and now revered, and he drank in their stories like water in a desert. And then he changed. He cast off his armor. He laid down the sword. He left the army. He walked away from rank, from power, from Rome. The name Longinus would come later, bestowed by tradition, whispered in reverence by those who heard his story. But to the empire he became nothing, a deserter, a disgrace. To the growing community of believers, he was a miracle. He traveled east, far from the seat of imperial control. To Cappadocia he went, where the name of Jesus was only beginning to take root, and there he began to speak. He told them of Golgotha, of the darkness, of the torn veil, of forgiveness uttered from a dying mouth, of a drop of blood and water that changed a life, and they listened, because he had not heard it second-hand. He was not repeating rumor. He had been there. He had held the spear, and now he held the truth. For years he lived as a monk, quietly, humbly. But the empire never forgets. Word spread. The authorities heard of a Roman soldier preaching the name of a crucified Jew. They came for him. They dragged him before the magistrate. They demanded he recant. "Swear by the gods of Rome," they said. "Offer incense. Deny this Christ." But Longinus stood firm. He had knelt at the foot of the cross. He had pierced the side of the Son of God. He would not bow to idols. They beat him, tore out his teeth, cut out his tongue. Still, he spoke. Still, he testified. They couldn't silence the truth carved into his soul. In the end, they executed him. Not for insubordination, not for desertion, but for faith. His blood, like the one he once shed, watered the earth. And in death, as in life, Longinus bore witness. Not to Caesar, not to Rome, but to the man he had crucified and come to love. The early church did not forget him. His story passed from tongue to tongue, from parchment to parchment, not because he was mighty, not any more, but because he had seen, because when the world turned away, he stayed, because when the Son of God breathed his last, Longinus breathed his first. The spear he once held, the lance that pierced the side of Christ, became known throughout Christendom as a relic of reverence. The Holy Lance. It would pass through empires, kingdoms, cathedrals. It would be claimed by emperors and lost in wars. But the man who wielded it, he became a saint. Venerated in both the Eastern and Western traditions, Saint Longinus became a symbol of ultimate conversion, of redemption not born of merit, but of mercy. They say his tomb is in Cappadocia, carved into the rock. Pilgrims still walk the winding paths to kneel where he once knelt, to pray where he once prayed. Not because he was perfect, but because he was transformed, because the darkest moment of his life, the piercing of an innocent man, became the beginning of his salvation. His legacy is not carved in marble statues or etched in Roman scrolls. It lives in the hearts of those who know what it means to fall to their knees and rise again with new eyes. So if you have ever felt unworthy, if your past is a chain, if you wonder whether grace can find even you, remember the soldier who held the spear, who saw the sky darken and the earth break, who struck the body of the Christ, and was struck, in return, by love. Longinus was not a preacher. He was not a disciple. He was not looking for salvation. But salvation found him, and it can find you, because no one is beyond the reach of the cross. The Centurion's testimony would echo across the centuries, and it would be carried not by parchment alone, but by the living witnesses of faith, the apostles, fishermen, tax collectors, rebels, friends, the very ones he once guarded, once dismissed, once thought mad. They would become messengers to the ends of the earth, to see their journeys, how they fled, how they returned, how they changed the world with nothing but truth and courage. You must follow their footsteps. Their stories wait for you. Click now to watch the next chapter, The Incredible Journeys of the 12 Apostles. Because the story didn't end at the cross, it began there.